the thought was that for the session tonight is that we wanted to do sort of an education session about nuclear weapons and issues related to the elimination of nuclear weapons, which are before us at the moment. And we thought that we would do this in the context of going through a PowerPoint presentation that's available on the PSR website, because the idea here is not just to spread the information to people, but to have a larger group of people who feel comfortable going out and disseminating this information themselves. And so the slideshow that we're going to be going through is one of many that different people in PSR have developed. This is one that I put together last year, and which we put on the website. And I think it's a good tool that anybody could pick up and use. As you can see, each slide comes with a text. If you want to, you could just read through the text directly while you're projecting the images up on the screen. Personally, I don't usually like using PowerPoints. I like to talk without them, but in this day and age, in many settings, if you don't have slides, you're not an expert, and you need to have them as a credential. So it's good in that regard as well. So to begin with, you're at a Grand Rounds or Dr. Group of Medical Students, and welcome. My name is Ira Helfand. I'm a representative of Physicians with Social Responsibility, which is an organization that was founded in 1961 to combat the potentially catastrophic effects of nuclear war. Today we have about 30,000 members, 29 chapters of doctors, and 25 student chapters around the country. We are the U.S. affiliate of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. And we recognize nuclear weapons and global warming as the preeminent threats to our nation and the world. And I want to talk with you tonight about the first of these dangers, nuclear war. There are a number of different ways that the nuclear threat can manifest itself. The first of these is the danger of nuclear terrorism. It's kind of hard to imagine how horrible it would be if a terrorist group were able to detonate a nuclear device in an American city. But it's not that hard to figure out how they might be able to do it, because building a crude nuclear device is something that's pretty easy. The information is widely available online. The ability to put together a bomb is pretty easy. The only thing that's difficult is getting the fissile material, the enriched uranium or the plutonium. And that's not an insurmountable barrier either. In the world today, there are 55 countries, including most notably Russia and Pakistan, that have poorly guarded military and civilian facilities, which have amongst them all more than 2,100 metric tons of fissile material. All told, there's over 3,000 tons of fissile material in the world, and that's enough to make 250,000 nuclear weapons. Mohammed al-Baradei, who's the head of the International Energy Agency, has said recently that there have been nearly 250 reports of traffic in nuclear materials each year during the last several years. So there's a lot of nuclear material out there and a lot of people trying to get hold of it. Now, several years ago, we published a study in the British Medical Journal looking at what exactly would happen if a 12.5 kiloton bomb, it's about the size of the Hiroshima bomb, was detonated by terrorists at a dock in Lower Manhattan. And we found that this explosion, even though it took place so that much of the explosion was dissipated out over the Hudson River, would still kill hundreds of thousands of people. We developed this scenario using specialized software that we obtained from FEMA, and we imagined this scenario because we thought that the most likely way that terrorists might get a nuclear weapon into a U.S. city would be to put it on a boat and bring it into a harbor. In this scenario, we found that the heat and the blast from the explosion would directly kill 52,000 people. As many as 238,000 other people would be exposed to radiation emanating from the blast. And of those, 44,000 would suffer radiation sickness, and another 10,000 would receive lethal doses from the initial explosion. But in addition, a cloud of radioactive debris would travel hundreds of miles over the next several days, depending on the wind patterns and the weather conditions. And in our study, we found that using the most common prevailing winds, another 1.5 million people would be exposed to this radioactive fallout unless they were sheltered or evacuated. And that 200,000 of these people would receive lethal doses and would die. In addition, there would be several hundred thousand additional cases of radiation sickness. Furthermore, the attack would cripple the healthcare system in the city. It would destroy 1,000 acute care hospital beds, and nearly 9,000 other beds would be in areas that needed to be abandoned because of heavy radioactive pollution. The impact on the rest of the country is kind of hard to imagine. I mean, we all know that on September 11th, the effects were not confined to lower Manhattan. There was an enormous impact on the entire country, and this certainly would be the case with a nuclear attack as well. A recent study, which is not referenced in the slideshow, but which people might want to know about, looked at the financial cost of an attack of this type and found that a Hiroshima-sized bomb going off in Manhattan could cause damage anywhere from 2 to 10 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars. And obviously this would have a devastating impact on the entire country. But even much more worrisome than the possibility of a terrorist attack, even though this is what people tend to focus on a lot, is the danger of a nuclear war between states that have nuclear weapons. I want to focus for a minute on the possibility of a war in South Asia between India and Pakistan. This is something which has, received a lot of attention from military experts and security experts because India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars since their independence in 1947. And there is a great deal of instability, political instability, particularly in Pakistan, and real fear that there could be a war in the future and that such a war might involve the use of nuclear weapons. A number of studies have looked at what would happen immediately, and the best estimate is that something in the range of 20 million people in the major cities in India and Pakistan would be killed directly from the explosions and the resultant fires. 20 million is about half the number of people who died during all of World War II, and this death toll would be inflicted on South Asia over a matter of a couple of days. There'd be tremendous radioactive contamination throughout the region, and this would cause more victims locally. But as horrible as the destruction in South Asia would be, it really is not the thing that we're most concerned about, which is, in fact, the global effects of this war that would be caused by global climate disruption. The soot and the smoke. So what happens in a nuclear war like this is that nuclear warheads go off over large cities. The cities burn and they release enormous amounts of soot, which is lofted up into the stratosphere, blocking out sunlight and dropping temperatures. And a recent study done by Robach and his colleagues showed that this limited war would put about 5 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, and that this would drop temperature globally an average of 1.25 degrees centigrade, an effect that would last for several years. And even 10 years out, the average cooling would be about a half degree centigrade. And this sounds like a very trivial number, but if we compare this to all of the global warming that has gone on in the last 130 years, we can see what an abrupt and large change this is. Since 1880, average temperature on the planet has gone up about half a degree. What would happen is in the matter of 1 to 3 days, temperature would drop by more than twice that amount. This would lead to a significant shortening of the growing season in many important grain-growing regions throughout the world. But as you can see, in Central North America and Central Eurasia, the growing season is shortened by anywhere from 20 to 30 days. And that's enough to completely eliminate some crops which simply would not have time to mature before they were killed off by the next frost. There would also be a very significant drop in precipitation worldwide because of the cooling. On average, that would be about 10%. But again, if you look at the areas that are highlighted in the red boxes, in important grain-growing areas in Eurasia and in North America, the decline of precipitation approaches 30 to 40%. And there would also be a 40% decline in the tropical monsoon in South Asia and Southeast Asia. There have been no studies done to this date to figure out exactly what the effect on agricultural production would be from this cooling and drying. But we do have some historical experience based on previous naturally occurring cooling episodes that gives some indication and suggests that the impact on food supplies would be very substantial. The best studied episode was 1816, the year without a summer, which followed the eruption of the Tambora volcano in Indonesia the year before that. Average cooling that time year was only 0.7 of a degree, about half of what would happen with a war in South Asia, and it only lasted for about a year. But that was enough to cause widespread disruption of agriculture. In North America, where this was studied very closely, there were 4 killing frosts in June, July, and August that basically killed off all the crops. There was a wide spread loss of agricultural production, price of grain doubled. In more populated areas in the old world, the consequences were far worse than they were in North America because of the high population density. And there was outright famine in Ireland, in France, in Switzerland, in Germany, and it was also reported in India and in Egypt that year. In the event of a nuclear war, there would be some other factors playing into the decline in agricultural production. 1816, it was mainly just cooling and lower precipitation. But in the event of a nuclear war, we would also have very large disruption of the ozone layer, with a resulting increase in the amount of UV light getting through the surface. This would be a health problem for human beings who would get sunburn and be at greater risk for skin cancer, but it would also be a problem for a lot of food crops. Many grains and cereals are very sensitive to UV light, and the increase in UV radiation on the surface would lower crop production. In addition, a nuclear war in South Asia would almost certainly disrupt petroleum supplies, and this has immense implications for modern agriculture, which is highly dependent on petroleum for insecticides, for pesticides, for fertilizer, and also for the fuel to run the tractors and the water pumps and so on that are an integral part of modern agriculture. Furthermore, there would probably be a diversion of significant amounts of grain production to ethanol to try to offset that, which would further exacerbate the food problem. We already see in the world today a significant diversion of grain, especially corn, to ethanol production, and that has had a significant effect in raising food prices, and this would be a much more severe effect in the setting of a nuclear war. A couple of other factors, depending on exactly where the war took place, large areas would be contaminated with radioactive material. Large stocks of food on the ground would have to be destroyed, and large areas would not be suitable for further food production. And finally, this kind of conflict would almost certainly cause a disruption in the international commerce in foodstuffs. At this point in time, we are extremely ill-prepared to deal with a major drop in food supply. And just to update the numbers which appear in the slideshow, as of January of 2010, global grain stocks were down to about 60 days of consumption, a little bit better than 2 years ago in August of 2007, but still at a low point in the last 50 years and dramatically less than the 100 to 120 days of food supplies that were available in the 1980s and the 1990s. These are totally inadequate food supplies, and there's been a great deal of concern in the food community about how tenuous a situation we're in right now, and where the stress of falling food production to be added to this, these food supplies will be exhausted very quickly. In addition, at baseline today, there are in the world millions of people who are suffering from chronic malnutrition. There's a fair amount of debate in the medical literature about exactly what the definition of malnutrition is, but generally speaking, there is consensus that the average adult needs between 1,800 and 2,000 calories a day, depending on his or her stature, to meet basic metabolic requirements and permit a minimal amount of physical activity. For children, obviously, the requirements depend on their age and size. There are today, and again to update the slide, the most recent estimate in January of this year, over 1 billion people in the world whose daily caloric intake falls below these minimum requirements. And each year, some 5 million children in this group starve to death. So a further decline in available food would put this entire group at risk. In addition, there are hundreds of millions of people who have adequate food consumption today, but who live in countries where most of the food is imported. And these people would also be at risk in the event that there was a disruption of food, of international commerce in food. These countries, like the countries of North Africa, the Middle East, many of the industrial countries in East Asia, like Malaysia, Japan, Taiwan, are completely dependent on imported food. Get up to 50% of total food comes from imports. Given these conditions, even a very small decline in agricultural production could trigger massive famine. And we know from the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, which is the most closely studied famine in history. This is the life's work of the Nobel economist Amartya Sen. What he found was that at the time of the Great Famine in 1943, food production was only down about 5% over the average of the preceding 5 years. And it was actually 13% higher than it had been in 1941, But in 1943, the Japanese had occupied Burma, which had historically been an area which exported grain to Bengal. And the decline in food production, coupled with the loss of imports from Burma, triggered a panic, basically. And the price of grain went up 5 times. Food was hoarded. And although there was just a small decline in the available food, the accessible food, the food that people could actually buy and put on the table, fell dramatically, and 3 million people died during this famine. I think we have to understand that in the event of a major cooling episode caused by regional nuclear war, we would expect to see the same kind of dramatic rises in food prices. There would be hoarding on a global scale, and countries that normally export grain would just stop doing that and would keep it for their own people. Given these conditions, we believe that it is reasonable to fear that the total death toll from starvation alone could be 1 billion people in the event of this kind of a limited regional nuclear war in South Asia. But there are other conditions which need to be looked at as well. In addition to people dying from famine, there would be many people who would be affected by epidemic diseases. Each of the major famines in history that have been studied have been associated with outbreaks of epidemic illness. The famine in 1816 triggered an epidemic of typhus in Ireland that spread to much of Europe. Famine in India that year led to an outbreak of cholera that has been implicated as the starting point of the first global cholera pandemic in the 1820s. At the time of the Bengal famine in 1943 that we were just talking about, there were local epidemics of cholera, of malaria, of smallpox, and of dysentery. And, despite the real advances in medical technology in the last half century, a global famine would undoubtedly trigger huge outbreaks of infectious diseases. In particular, the huge megacities in the developing world, which are crowded and often lack poor sanitation during the best of times, would be breeding grounds for epidemic disease. And all of the usual suspects would be around. Illnesses like plague, which have not played a big role in recent years, might emerge again as major health problems. In addition, we need to consider the huge potential for further conflict in the event of a famine on this scale. Within countries where famine was widespread, there would almost certainly be food riots. Competition for limited food resources might well exacerbate regional and ethnic animosities. Among nations, armed conflict would be highly likely, especially as the states that are dependent on imports did whatever they could in an attempt to maintain access to their food supplies. And in the worst case, this might involve further use of nuclear weapons. It is really not possible, therefore, to estimate fully what the global toll from this limited nuclear war would be. But I think we have to understand that the information which the climate people have brought to us indicates that even a war that appears initially limited to a small part of the globe would have horrible, catastrophic, worldwide effects. And there are major implications for nuclear weapons policy inherent in this data. There are implications for policy in areas like India and Pakistan. There are implications for U.S.-Russian negotiations on the size of our strategic arsenals. The best estimates of where we might get to in the next few years would still leave us with 1,000 warheads on either side, far more than are necessary to trigger this kind of scenario that we've just been talking about. But as frightening as all of this is not the gravest danger that we face from nuclear weapons. And we need to be clear about that. There's a lot of public discussion about the irresponsible countries that might get it through nuclear proliferation, about the terrorists who might get hold of nuclear weapons. The real danger, the really horrible danger, still remains that posed by the warheads in the arsenals of the two superpowers, the United States and Russia, which between them have 95% of the nuclear weapons in the world, more than 20,000 warheads. Most alarmingly, 2,500 of these warheads are maintained on hair-trigger alert. They're mounted on missiles that can be launched in a matter of minutes and reach targets in the next country half an hour later. So what I'd like to do is talk about the effects of a really big nuclear war for a while. And I want to start by describing in some detail at this point what would happen to a city that was subject to a large-scale nuclear weapons attack. I'm going to talk about a 20-megaton bomb hitting a major city. Now, In the 1960s, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union actually had weapons of this size. Since then, the arsenals have been modernized, and they have more weapons, they have smaller weapons. An attack on a big city like New York or Boston or Chicago would involve not one 20-megaton bomb, but 10 to 20 half-megaton weapons. The actual explosive force would be somewhat less, but the destruction would actually be greater than what I'm going to describe because it would be spread out more efficiently over the entire metropolitan area. But it's hard to visualize 20 or 15 or 20 bombs going off all over the place. And so the model of a single explosion in one place, even though it underestimates destruction a little bit, I think is adequate for our purposes. Within 1,000th of a second, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this entire area, temperature would rise to 20 million degrees Fahrenheit, which is hotter than the surface of the sun. And everything, the buildings, the trees, the cars, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would be vaporized. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the blast would generate pressures in excess of 25 pounds per square inch and winds greater than 650 miles an hour. Forces of this magnitude can destroy essentially anything that human beings can build, including reinforced concrete and steel buildings and underground structures which would be collapsed. Shelters underground would just collapse under the pressure from an explosion of this sort. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would still be intense enough to melt automobile sheet metal. To a distance of 10 miles in every direction, the blast would create pressures of 7 to 10 pounds per square inch and winds of 200 miles per hour. To a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable, paper, cloth, wood, gasoline, heating oil, would ignite, starting hundreds of thousands of fires. And fanned by blast winds still in excess of 100 miles per hour, these fires would coalesce into a giant firestorm, more than 30 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, everything would be consumed by the flames, and every living thing would die. The temperatures would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All the oxygen would be consumed, and they would be. This is a zone of total lethality. Beyond this firestorm, the destruction would still continue. At 21 miles out from ground zero, the blast would still produce pressures of 2 pounds per square inch. That's not enough to do a lot of structural damage to a building, but it is enough to shatter glass and turn every window into hundreds of missiles flying outward from the center to injure people. As far as 40 miles from ground zero, anyone who turned to look at the sudden flash of light would be blinded by retinal burning. In a city the size of Boston, which was the one that was studied by PSR back in 1961, 1 million people would die instantly. Another 1 million people would suffer injuries from which they could not recover no matter what kind of medical care were available to them. Another 1 million people would suffer wounds from which they might recover if intensive medical care were available. And in the whole metropolitan area, there might be something like 100,000 people with relatively minor injuries or who weren't injured at all. In the immediate aftermath of this explosion, burns would be the dominant injury. And there would be hundreds of thousands of people with major second, third-degree burns. Some who got just direct heat exposure from the blast itself, others who were burned by the firestorm. These people would need the most intensive kind of medical therapy that we can offer. As all of you know, burn patients require intensive care with enormous amounts of nursing care, of repeated trips to the OR for debridement. They need enormous quantities of blood products, of antibiotics, of IV fluids. People would not get this care. In the entire United States, there are only 2,000 burn beds, and even in a big medical center like Boston or San Francisco, there are only about 100 burn beds. All of these would have been destroyed by the explosion. And at best, a tiny fraction of the hundreds of thousands of burn patients would receive any kind of significant medical care, and the rest would simply die. In addition to the burn patients, there'd be all kinds of other mechanical injuries. People who were blinded by the flash, people who were deafened when their eardrums were ruptured by the overpressures, people with collapsed lungs from the overpressures, people with stab wounds from flying debris, people with broken bones from crushing injuries when buildings collapsed on them, and so on. And if this attack were part of a general attack on the entire United States, then the kind of destruction we've just been talking about would be visited on every major metropolitan area in the United States. A report that we in PSR released in 2002 showed that if only 500 warheads in the Russian arsenal hit major U.S. cities, 100 million people would die in the first half hour, and tens of millions of people would be fatally injured. And the same thing would happen in Russia in response to U.S. retaliatory attack. In addition, huge swaths of the country would be blanketed by radioactive fallout. And perhaps more importantly, the entire infrastructure of the country, the industrial infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, the communications infrastructure, it would all be destroyed. We depend on that infrastructure to survive. We're not hunter-gatherers. We don't grow our own food. We don't make our own shelter. And those of us who would survive initial attack would inhabit this nightmare landscape compared to which the Stone Age would look like some pristine paradise. In the months after this attack, almost all of the people in the United States and Russia would die from epidemic disease, from exposure, from starvation, from radiation sickness. But again, this isn't the full story, because just as the war in South Asia caused huge climate effects, this war causes even more massive climate disruption. The South Asia war releases about 5 million tons of debris into the upper atmosphere. A war involving the arsenals which the U.S. and Russia maintain on high alert puts 50 million tons of debris into the upper atmosphere. And if the strategic arsenals of both countries were involved, the full arsenal, that number rises to 150 to 180 million tons. So the drop in temperature that you would see 2 years after this kind of a war. On average, temperatures across the planet would fall 10 degrees centigrade, 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are temperatures which are colder than anything which we have seen on Earth in the last 18,000 years, since the coldest time of the last ice age. And if you look at the slide, you can see that this is not an evenly distributed fall in temperature. Over large areas in central parts of North America and central parts of Eurasia, the drop in temperature is as much as 30 degrees centigrade. These are huge departures from the norm. We're just seeing a map of the world, and it shows the cloud of dust rising out of the U.S. and Russia and engulfing the entire world. And it's a very simple graphic. It's very powerful. And what I tell people is what you are watching is the end of the world. Given atmospheric conditions of the sort that this would cause, there would not be a single day free of frost in the major agricultural areas in the Northern Hemisphere for 3 years. Agriculture would be impossible. Ecosystems would collapse. There would be global starvation. And many species, including quite possibly our own, would become extinct. It is important, as we discuss the effects of nuclear war, that we understand that this is not just some kind of a theoretical danger. This is a real and present danger which we face every day. On January 25th, 1995, the United States launched a weather rocket from Norway to study the Northern Lights. We told the Russians that we were doing this, that there were protocols for informing the other side when you launched a missile. But somebody in Moscow didn't pass the notice on to the appropriate people. And when Russian military radar picked up this launch on their radar screens, the rocket had separated into 4 stages. They thought it looked like 4 warheads coming from the U.S. nuclear attack submarine off the coast of Norway. For the only time that we know of in the entire nuclear weapons era, the special briefcase that the Russian president carries to respond to a nuclear attack was activated. And President Yeltsin, who was a man with serious health and alcohol abuse problems, was given a series of options that ranged from doing nothing to launching a full-scale attack on the United States. And he was given about 5 minutes to decide. Now, both Russia and the United States operate their nuclear forces under a doctrine called launch on warning. That means if they believe they are under attack, they're supposed to launch a counterattack immediately and not wait for the other side's missiles to land and explode. We don't know what went on that morning in the Kremlin. We don't know if it was Yeltsin or somebody else who made the decision. But somebody said, we're not going to follow our own doctrine. We're not going to launch a retaliatory attack. We're going to wait a couple of minutes and see what happens. And within a few minutes, it became clear that this was not an attack, that the missiles, that the blips on the radar were not missiles approaching Moscow. January 25th, 1995 was an ordinary day, in a time which was much safer than our own. There were no major crises any place in the world. The United States hadn't invaded Iraq or Afghanistan yet. September 11th hadn't taken place. The Indians and the Pakistanis hadn't tested their nuclear weapons yet. The North Koreans hadn't tested their nuclear weapons yet. It was a very peaceful time compared to the present. and we almost blew up the whole world. So this is the danger that we face, and it is huge, and it's imminent, and it's not a very pleasant thing to look at. But what we have to understand is this is not a picture of what has to happen. It's only what may happen if we don't act. And I'm talking to you today, a medical audience, because we as health professionals have a special obligation to address this threat. We're seen by the rest of the public as the guardians of public health. And when we speak out against this, the gravest threat to human survival, we have a special credibility. It was precisely our power to educate the public and our leaders about the dangers of nuclear war that led the Nobel Committee to award PSR and IPPNW the Peace Prize in 1985. And that responsibility adheres to us today. In response to this situation, IPPNW and PSR have launched a campaign of ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And we are seeking to build support worldwide to weapons conventions that ban weapons from the arsenals of all nations. It's important for us to understand that as dangerous as the situation is right now, we're also, in some ways, in a much more hopeful place than we've been for at least the last decade. We have a new administration. President Obama has said publicly that he wants to eliminate nuclear weapons, and he has called for a summit meeting in April in Washington of all the nuclear powers to address what we need to do next. I think we all are concerned that the great promise that his election held out is not being fully realized at this point. But he remains the first leader, really, in the nuclear era to take the abolition of nuclear weapons as a central goal of his administration. In addition, the abolition of nuclear weapons is endorsed by numbers of key military and policy leaders, including people who are generally thought of as being very hawkish on weapons issues. The Gang of Four here in the United States, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary Shultz, former Defense Secretary Perry, and Senator Sam Nunn have issued two statements that they published in the Wall Street Journal. Shultz and Kissinger are Republicans, Perry and Nunn are Democrats, calling for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. They've been joined by similar groups of defense experts in a whole host of countries. There's a Gang of Four in Germany, there's one in the Netherlands, there's one in Norway, there's one in Japan, who've published similar articles. There's a group in the UK, all calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. There's an enormous amount of support for this among military and security thinkers and leaders. There are a number of steps that we can take to achieve the abolition, sort of steps along the way. First, we need to take the weapons off of hair trigger alert. As I mentioned before, we've got still 2,900 warheads that can be fired in 15 minutes. We need to take a number of steps so these weapons can't be launched quickly, so that an accidental launch is impossible, and so that world leaders have to stop and think before they launch a nuclear attack. This is something which President Obama and President Medvedev can do on their own as commanders-in-chief of their respective militaries. And as soon as the nuclear posture review is released next Monday, March 1st, it is our hope that President Obama is going to do this, and if he doesn't, I think we need to put a lot of pressure on him to do this. Next step to zero, we can cut down the size of the U.S. and Russian arsenals. The United States and Russia are currently engaged in START negotiations to further cut the size of the arsenals. Again, these negotiations have not gone as quickly as we had. There was initially an expectation this treaty would be completed by last December. It's still not fully negotiated, and the number is not going to probably be 1,000, but closer to 1,500. Nonetheless, it looks like this treaty will be completed soon, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, and submitted to the United States Senate for ratification. And when this happens, PSR is going to have a major job of trying to win endorsement, ratification of this treaty in the Senate. We can also get the United States Senate to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. CTBT has been signed by 180 countries. It's been ratified by 145, but there are 8 countries which have not ratified it, which need to do so for the treaty to come into force. And the United States is the key to this process. We took the lead in negotiating the treaty. It's been a goal of every administration from Eisenhower through Clinton. We were the first country to sign it in 1996 when it was negotiated. But the United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty in 1999, and President Obama has said now that he's going to bring it back to the Senate this year, probably, for ratification vote. Again, this is a place where PSR has an enormous opportunity to make a contribution by building support in the key states where there are moderate Republican senators who might vote for the treaty. At this point, it is believed that all 59 Democratic senators will vote for the CTBT. It takes 67 votes to ratify a treaty. We need to get 8 Republican votes. So far, not a single Republican has indicated publicly support for the treaty, and this is something that we need to work on. The next step that we can do is to negotiate a fissile material cutoff treaty. It's a treaty that bans the production of enriched uranium, highly enriched uranium, and plutonium. Negotiations for this treaty have been blocked at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva by Pakistan, and we need to figure out how to move this process forward. And it's going to be, I believe, one of the key steps that will be discussed at the summit in April that Obama is convening. The United States can and should remove the remaining tactical warheads that we have in Europe. We've got about 200 warheads there. They serve no useful purpose except to antagonize and frighten the Russians. Many European countries are now asking the United States to withdraw these weapons. And hopefully the Obama administration will do this again after the nuclear posture review is completed next week. So PSR's basic message on this has been really, at heart, quite simple. Nuclear war is a problem for which there is no cure, and in that situation we are obliged to work to prevent it. We, as I mentioned earlier, as physicians, as medical students, as other health professionals, have a special obligation to work for this. And I think it's important that we understand that although this is an enormous responsibility, it is also an incredible gift in some ways. Very few people in all of history were given the opportunity to do good for the world. We have been given the opportunity, literally, to save the world. And while that is an immense responsibility and in some senses a terrible burden, it's also a real privilege to be in a position to have that kind of an effect.